Every empire swears its money is safe. Every government insists its promises will last forever. And every single time, history proves them wrong. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy to modern Lebanon, people have woken up to find their savings worthless, their salaries meaningless, and their futures stolen by systems they thought were solid. Currency collapse isn't rare, it's the rule. Financial disaster isn't the exception, it's the rhythm of human civilization. The real question isn't if money fails, it's when it does. What will you hold in your hands that's still real? The illusion of permanence is the most dangerous financial mistake you can make. We look at our bank balances, our national currencies, and we assume they're bedrock. But money is not bedrock. Money is trust, and trust can vanish overnight. History is full of tombstones made from that same misplaced faith. But if you look closely, each collapse leaves behind a message, written in pain, panic, and survival. Those who endured weren't the ones who trusted most. They were the ones who doubted first. Take the Byzantine Empire. That magnificent continuation of Rome that stood for nearly 1,000 years after the Western Empire crumbled. At the heart of its economy was the solidus, a gold coin so pure and stable that merchants across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia accepted it without question. It was the Bitcoin of the medieval world, unshakable, universal, and immune, or so they thought, to human greed. For centuries, the solidus anchored trade. Empires rose and fell around it, but the coin endured. But then came the slow poison of temptation, the oldest political disease, debasement. Rulers began to stretch the gold thinner, mix in cheaper metals, and clip its purity just a little at a time. No one noticed at first. But trust, like gold, is fragile. Once diluted, it never returns to its former shine. The merchants started to weigh coins instead of counting them. Foreign traders demanded better payment. And soon, the once mighty solidus, the currency of kings and crusaders, became just another political fiction. The Byzantine economy cracked, and with it, centuries of stability dissolved into dust. What survived? Not the imperial decrees, not the promises stamped on the coins. It was the merchants and landowners who had quietly hoarded real gold, real land, and real value outside the empire's reach. While everyone else watched their savings evaporate, the doubters endured. That's the first timeless lesson of history. Governments cannot resist the temptation to dilute their money. And when they do, wealth flows out of the system, into whatever can't be faked. But debasement isn't the only force that destroys value. Sometimes collapse comes not from the mint, but from the plague. In the mid-1300s, Europe faced a terror that made war look small, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, half of Europe's population disappeared. Cities emptied, villages vanished, fields went untended. It was a catastrophe beyond comprehension. And yet, out of the ashes, a strange economic shift began. When half of the workforce dies, the price of labor explodes. Farmers, craftsmen, and even peasants could suddenly demand higher wages. For the first time in history, the poor had leverage, and those who survived with even a little silver or property found themselves standing at the gates of opportunity. Land that once belonged to nobles was sold for pennies. Empty houses were taken over by new families. The social order cracked, and new wealth emerged in unexpected hands. Crises don't just destroy, they redistribute. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it rearranged power. Those who had liquidity, silver, goods, or simply the ability to produce, climbed. Those who had only promises, fell. Sound familiar? It should, because we've lived through our own version. The COVID-19 pandemic wasn't carried by rats, but by airplanes and screens. Supply chains broke. Governments printed trillions to keep the machine running. And as the flood of money hit the system, something eerie happened. Asset prices soared. The rich got richer. Ordinary people, those living paycheck to paycheck, were left behind. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Pandemics reward those with reserves and punish those without them. In both the 14th century and the 21st, survival belonged to those who entered the storm with resources, not hope. But while plagues remind us how fragile production is, another story from history shows us how fragile institutions can be. And this one begins in a city that was once the financial capital of the world. Renaissance Florence. In the 1340s, Florence was the beating heart of European banking. Families like the Bardi and the Peruzzi ran vast international networks of credit, lending to kings and popes alike. Their ledgers reached from London to Constantinople. And their greatest client? Edward III of England. Edward borrowed colossal sums to fund his wars with France. And then one day, he simply refused to pay. The result was catastrophic. Both banks collapsed almost overnight. Depositors were ruined, trade froze, and Florence, the richest city in Christendom, was thrown into panic. The ordinary citizen who had trusted those powerful banking dynasties discovered something timeless. Too big to fail is a lie as old as finance itself. Size is not safety. Reputation is not protection. When the mighty fall, they take the trusting down with them. From Florence in the 14th century to Lehman Brothers in 2008, and from Lehman to the banks of Lebanon in 2019, the pattern doesn't change. The collapse of institutions always begins with confidence and ends with betrayal. The survivors are never the ones who trust until the last moment. They're the ones who quietly step away before the music stops. It's a brutal truth, but history has no mercy for the naive. And so, by the middle of the 14th century, Europe had already lived through two lessons. Money loses value when rulers print too much of it. And systems collapse when lenders trust kings more than reality. The pattern was set. But the world was far from finished learning, because the next great experiment with paper money, the one that would tear a nation apart, was waiting across the ocean. And this time, the lesson would be written not in gold or silver, but in blood and inflation. The American Civil War is remembered for its battles, its heroes, and the abolition of slavery. But behind the thunder of cannons, another kind of war was being fought. A quiet, invisible war of currency and confidence. Because both the Union and the Confederacy discovered the same brutal truth. When gold runs out, nations start printing belief. In the North, Abraham Lincoln's government issued something new. The greenback. It wasn't backed by gold, but by trust in the United States itself. A bold experiment in faith. And for a while, it worked. It paid soldiers, fueled industry, and kept the economy alive when real gold was scarce. But every note printed was a promise. And promises, when multiplied too freely, always weaken. As the war dragged on and the presses kept running, each greenback bought a little less. Prices rose, confidence wavered, and the same paper that had once symbolized patriotism began to represent uncertainty. But in the South, things were far worse. The Confederacy, desperate to survive, printed money by the wagon load. Graybacks backed by nothing but hope. When that hope faded, so did the value. By the end of the war, inflation had consumed everything. A barrel of flour could cost a soldier's entire paycheck. Families carried sacks of bills to buy a loaf of bread. Money became firewood, useful only for kindling. By 1865, Confederate currency wasn't weak, it was dead. The lesson was painful but clear. When a government's survival depends on a printing press, its currency is already doomed. In the aftermath, the winners were not those who held paper, but those who held things the system couldn't print. Land, gold, silver, livestock, or food. Hard value outlived hollow promises. It was a mirror image of what France had already endured decades earlier. And once again, it would prove that revolutions can change governments, but they can't change the laws of trust. In 1790s France, revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy, seized church lands, and declared a new era of liberty. To stabilize the economy, they issued a new paper money, the assignat. It was supposed to be safe, backed by confiscated property. At first, it was a symbol of progress, of freedom, of a new beginning. But the temptation to print just a little more proved irresistible. Soon, there were too many assignats chasing too few goods. Prices soared. Bread, once a symbol of daily life, became a luxury. And as faith collapsed, so did the new republic's economy. Farmers refused to sell food for paper. Markets shut down. People bartered for survival. And the government that had promised equality brought starvation instead. By the time the assignat was worthless, so was the public's faith in paper itself. France's economy lay in ruins. Its money, a bold experiment in idealism, had turned to dust. The winners were not the dreamers who held patriotic currency. They were the realists who held grain, gold, and property. The tangible things no regime could print or confiscate into existence. The lesson cut deep. Every financial revolution eventually faces its own truth test. Can your paper buy bread? But while France struggled to rebuild, another empire across the ocean was learning how trust could unravel without a single bullet fired. Because collapse doesn't always come through war or revolution. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as prosperity. Fast forward to the late 20th century. Asia was booming. Skyscrapers in Bangkok and Seoul gleamed like symbols of a new world. Foreign investors called it the Asian miracle. And for a while, it truly seemed unstoppable. But miracles built on debt are fragile. Many of these nations had pegged their currencies to the US dollar, borrowing heavily in dollars to fund their growth. As long as the dollar stayed stable, so did they. But in 1997, that balance cracked. Speculators began betting against the Thai baht, believing the peg couldn't hold. When it broke, it set off a chain reaction that would shake the entire continent. The baht collapsed. Investors panicked. Currencies across Southeast Asia tumbled one after another. Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, all pulled into the same spiral. Factories closed. Businesses failed. Jobs vanished. And families who had saved for decades saw their money lose half its value in weeks. The people who suffered most weren't the hedge funds that triggered the collapse. They were the ordinary citizens whose mortgages, salaries, and savings were suddenly worth nothing. Because when your debt is in someone else's currency, you don't own your future. You rent it. And when the landlord comes calling, he doesn't care about your crisis. The pattern was ancient, but the tools were new. From the Byzantine coin to the French assignat, from Confederate paper to the Thai baht, the lesson didn't change. Debt chains the borrower to the lender, and inflation steals from those who trust. It was history's same cruel poetry, just set to a modern rhythm. But for those who looked closely, another truth was emerging. Every collapse hides two stories, the story of those who lose everything, and the story of those who saw it coming. Because for every banker ruined in Florence, there was a merchant who kept gold hidden in a wall. For every worker crushed by Confederate inflation, there was a farmer who traded in food instead of notes. For every family who lost their home in Asia, there was an investor who shifted into dollars before the storm hit. History doesn't punish everyone equally. It rewards awareness. That's what makes financial collapse both tragic and fascinating. It isn't just an economic event. It's a test of perception. Those who see money as permanent always lose. Those who understand its fragility and move early endure. And that brings us closer to our time. Because the story isn't ancient anymore. It's not about crumbling empires or forgotten kingdoms. It's about now. About the people standing in line outside banks, waiting for doors that may never open again. In the 21st century, collapse doesn't announce itself with armies or revolutions. It comes quietly, through frozen accounts, runaway inflation, or a silent click that says access denied. And when it happens, every nation, every citizen, every saver learns the same truth all over again. Money is not wealth. It's only the story we tell ourselves about trust. And when that story breaks, the world changes overnight. In Lebanon, between 2019 and 2021, something unthinkable happened. The banks, once symbols of security, locked their doors. Citizens woke up to find their accounts frozen, withdrawals restricted, and their life savings trapped behind screens. The Lebanese pound collapsed, losing more than 90% of its value. Doctors, engineers, teachers, retirees, people who had worked for decades, watched their money dissolve like smoke. It wasn't stolen with guns. It was stolen with policy. People stood outside the banks, pleading for access to their own money. Some broke in, desperate to withdraw enough to feed their families. And all the while, the same officials who had promised stability assured everyone that the situation was temporary. But history whispered otherwise. It had seen this before, in Rome, in Byzantium, in France, in Argentina, and now in Beirut. The illusion of safety is the last stage before collapse. When everyone believes the system can't fail, that's usually the moment it already has. In Lebanon, The survivors weren't the wealthy. They were the skeptical, the ones who had moved their savings abroad, held gold, or kept cash hidden outside the banking system. Everyone else was trapped, watching their country's wealth melt into dust. It was a chilling reminder of something people in developed nations still refuse to believe. Your money in the bank is not a treasure chest. It is a loan you've given to an institution that might decide one day not to pay you back. If that sounds far away, it shouldn't. Because in 2008, the same story played out on a larger stage. The world watched as the great pillars of modern finance, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, collapsed under the weight of their own illusions. Homes were repossessed, pensions were destroyed, and millions lost their jobs. Yet the banks that caused the crisis were bailed out with newly printed money. The system didn't break. It shifted. Wealth didn't disappear. It moved. Then came 2020. A pandemic swept the world, freezing supply chains and economies. Governments responded by printing trillions. It was supposed to save the system. Instead, it inflated it. The rich saw their assets explode in value. Stocks, property, even art. Ordinary people saw their wages stagnate while their cost of living soared. History's rhythm hadn't changed. It had only sped up. Crises reward those with assets and punish those without them. And by 2023, the pattern reappeared yet again. Regional banks in the United States collapsed almost overnight when depositors lost confidence. Suddenly, even the idea of too big to fail felt like a fairy tale. Trust, once broken, never returns quietly. So the question becomes, how do you protect yourself when everything falls apart? History doesn't offer comfort, but it offers clues. In Byzantium, the answer was gold. After the Black Death, it was liquidity. Silver and savings ready to seize abandoned land. In Florence, it was independence from bankers. In the Confederacy, it was hard goods, food, property, tools, anything tangible. In France, it was land and grain, not paper. In Asia, it was avoiding debt in someone else's currency. In Lebanon, it was getting out before the doors shut. The details change, but the pattern is constant. Survival comes not from trust in systems, but from understanding their fragility. Collapse always begins with faith, and ends with realization. Those who see it early aren't lucky. They're awake. But there's another side to collapse that most people never see. Because while it destroys millions, it also creates openings for a few. Moments when everything once expensive becomes cheap. When the world resets, and when the bold quietly become the new elite. After the Black Death, peasants became landowners. So much land lay empty that laborers, once invisible, suddenly had bargaining power. They rose from serfs to landholders almost overnight. After the crash of 2008, those with liquidity bought homes while millions lost theirs. The wealth didn't vanish. It simply changed hands. Every collapse is a transfer, from those who trust to those who prepare, from those who cling to illusions to those who hold what can't be printed away. That is the paradox of every financial disaster. Collapse is both punishment and opportunity. It's tragedy for the unprepared, and leverage for the alert. But wealth alone isn't enough. Because when paper fails, so does production. And what saves people in the aftermath isn't to what they own, it's what they can do. When money loses meaning, skills become currency. The baker who can still make bread, the farmer who can still grow food, the craftsman who can still fix and build. These are the real survivors. Every empire has fallen. Every coin has devalued. But humanity always rebuilds through labor and skill. Value never disappears. It only changes form. So yes, history is a graveyard of currencies. But it's also a roadmap for survival. It tells us that every financial system, no matter how mighty, eventually becomes a story of lost trust. But it also tells us that renewal always begins with those who can create real value when others can tea. And that brings us to today, an era of digital money, rising debt, and vanishing certainty. Governments print at will. Central banks promise stability while quietly debasing currencies to keep the illusion alive. The numbers grow higher, but the trust grows weaker. And somewhere in the background, history clears its throat. Because no matter how modern we become, the laws haven't changed. Every empire swears its money is safe. Every government promises its system will endure. And every time, they're wrong. So perhaps the question isn't when collapse comes next, but who will be ready when it does? Will you be holding paper or value? Will you be trusting or preparing? Will you be part of the many who believe or the few who see? Because when trust disappears, history doesn't stop. It resets. And those who understand that, those who study the ruins and learn the rhythms, are never crushed by them. They rebuild on stronger ground. They see what's coming while others call it impossible. And when the dust settles, they don't just survive the new world, they own it. Every crisis is a transfer, from illusion to reality, from promises to proof, from dreamers to doers. And when the next storm arrives, as it always does, the only real question will be, when the world's money burns again, what will you still have that's real?